afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this workshop. You see the title. It's really a mouthful, and I'll explain very briefly. New Battlefields, Old Laws When Disaster Hits, Threats, Preparedness, and Legal Gaps. It should be plural. I'm going to be very brief in my introduction and then turn it over to my co-chair, Professor Daphné Richemond-Barak, to introduce the remainder of our panel. I want to do actually three things, and I'll do them in the order that occurs to me. The first is to explain the sort of prefix for the title of this panel, New Battlefields, Old Laws. This is a series that Syracuse and ICT have been doing together since 2006. I believe this may be our 13th collaborative workshop. We've been engaged in a project since the Second Lebanon War in 2006 when we sat around here in that hot summer. Maybe it wasn't as hot as this one, but it was hot, and we were lamenting the fact that as Israel was trying to beat back at the attacks that were coming to it on a daily basis during that war, that the world media was hitting hard on Israel for the efforts to hit back inside the Hezbollah embattlements or encampments inside Lebanon where there might be collateral harm to civilians. And we worried about the fact that Israel, like the United States and other Western nations, play by the rules in armed conflict that the terrorists do not. What can we do? The laws that were written to govern conflict were written for state-on-state conflict, where states agree, after all, to abide by certain rules to protect civilians from harm during conflict. Terrorists do not recognize those rules. So we came up with this not very clever acronym, New Battlefields, Old Laws, and have been engaged now for more than a decade to talk about ways in which legal reform might be necessary to accommodate asymmetric warfare against non-state actors. That's it in a nutshell. That's the explanation for the second title. Now the explanation for this very handsome man whose photo you see in the first slide here. That man is Jerry Kramer. Jerry, who was a great friend to ICT and to Syracuse, passed away on February 18th of this year, and his wife, he and his wife Daphné, are among the few couples that have been named honorary fellows of the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya for their individual activities and their achievements. Jerry was awarded his honorary fellow in 2007, Daphné the year after in 2000, or the decade later, just this year, 2018. Jerry was really a giant of a man. I don't know if any of you in this room knew him, but he was a leader in the United States and internationally in the field of investments. He was known for his generous contributions both here in Israel, in the United States, and abroad. He happens to be an alumnus of Syracuse University. There's the connection. But he's been a great friend of IDC and Israel for many, many years. His wife Daphné is Israeli, and he and Daphné just divided their time between Israel and the United States. And when they learned about 15 years ago that Syracuse had developed a program that was a little bit like ICT, being a smart man, Jerry said, we should get you guys together. And he literally did. And then he provided the financial support to allow us to get our work done. There's no better gift than allowing intellectual growth and new ideas to be fostered and shared across oceans, across legal systems, and across cultures. And he did that in so many ways, and we're going to miss him terribly. This message is in part for everyone, but it's also in part for Daphné, who remains a very vital member of the ICT and Syracuse community. Daphné is not with us today, but I'm sure she's watching and listening somewhere. And in fact, I was in touch with her just a couple of days ago, and she sends her warmest regards. Third thing, let me say just a word about the topic today. It's not one that you would expect to find necessarily in a conference on counterterrorism, but we're going to show you why it is and why it's of central importance. The three of us at this table, Katja Samuel, who's at the far end, Daphné, and I have been involved in co-authoring a book chapter in recent months under the very effective leadership of Katja Samuel that has a very simple but very important point. The principal challenges that are in terrorism are about managing effects, not purposes. Our view and the thesis of the panel this afternoon is that counterterrorism and disaster preparedness and response would be well served if we conceived of both of them in terms of their scale and their effects, not so much in terms of their motivation or causation. So we're going to be talking about a way to get counterterrorism done better by conceiving of it as equivalent to disaster, floods, fires, earthquakes, storms. There are economies to be gained, there's better thinking to be had, and I think we can all advance the interest of counterterrorism if, as the saying goes, take a page from the disaster playbook. So now I'm going to ask Daphné to please introduce the panel.
Okay, so before I do that, before I introduce the very distinguished members of this panel, I also want to say just really one word about the extreme privilege that I've had working with you, Bill, working with Syracuse, working with INSCT for so many years. I would actually like to agree with you on something. Can we stop counting them?
Yes.
Okay, good. So over a decade sounds just about right. So over a decade of working together and actually doing this workshop in the memory of Jerry Kramer today is moving, and it's meaningful because he was a real friend of Syracuse, a real friend of ICT, of IDC, and he's now enabled us to do so much. So we're very grateful, and I'm personally very grateful to always have you by my side. Or to be always by your side, I don't know, depends how you look at it, but that we do this work again and again together, and thank you all for being here. So that's just with my few words of very short introduction about this project and about our relationships here. So what we like to do in this project actually is to have some people who come back, some people who are new, to kind of like continue a dialogue. So there's a dialogue here definitely going on between Bill and myself for many years, as you could figure it out, and with Katja for the past 2 years. And so we also like to invite fresh ideas and new people to kind of like make us think deeper, advance us, and get to the next stage in our thinking. So this is exactly what we're doing today. And I would like to introduce our speakers. I'll introduce all of you, and we'll be done with that, and we can have our presentations. We're also hoping to take a break during the session, so just so you know. So first of all, the first speaker today will be Professor Kristian Lauta, who's an associate professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Copenhagen, and chairperson of the Copenhagen Center for Disaster Research. He is a prolific author in the field of disaster, not only disaster law, on which he published a book in 2015, but actually looking very broadly at disaster and at the intersection of disaster with other fields that that a lot of people hadn't even explored prior to his incredible work. Disaster and governance, how disaster affects society. So a lot of different aspects, disaster and human rights, that are incredibly interesting. He's a senior editor of the European Journal of Risk Regulation and has edited special issues of that journal and of the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. He's also very active in research at the European level. He's a principal investigator and initiator of projects at the European level, including Horizon 2020 project Espresso. He's been a visiting scholar at Berkeley, at Cambridge, and he's a member of the Royal Danish Academy for Sciences and Letters, Young Academy, which is quite impressive as well. So thank you very much, Kristian, for being with us today. Our next speaker will be Professor Banks. I will introduce you as well. Professor Banks is a Syracuse University College of Law Board of Advisors Distinguished Professor, and also Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs. So both Maxwell and law. He was also the interim dean of Syracuse Law in 2015. He's founded and directed the Institute for National Security and Counter-Terrorism at Syracuse University. This is INSCT, our partner in this enterprise here. He's published numerous books. He's a leading scholar on national security. He's got a textbook on national security law, and his latest book is entitled "Soldiers on the Home Front: The Domestic Role of the American Military," which was published with Harvard University Press in 2016. And I've already said how happy I am that you're here. I don't need to say that again. Next speaker will be Professor Pinchas Halpern, who actually brings a totally different perspective to this panel because he comes from a different field. He's first of all the director of the Emergency Medicine Department at the Tel-Aviv Sourasky Medical Center here in Israel. He's also, and most importantly, a research fellow at the ICT. He's trained in diving and hyperbaric medicine at the Israeli Navy Diving Medical Institute, in anesthesia and intensive care at Rambam and Ichilov hospitals, and at the Ohio State University. He's also an associate clinical professor in anesthesia, critical care, and emergency medicine at Tel Aviv. And he's been visiting professor in many different universities worldwide. And I think very interestingly, also for this panel and for our discussion, he's led and trained clinical missions in emergency medicine and disaster medicine to no less than Ethiopia, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Jordan, Poland, and the USA. And he's also participated in disaster relief efforts in Turkey in the wake of the Turkey earthquake. So, last but certainly not least, Dr. Katia Samuel, who, as I said, has been part of this already for over a year, is the director of Global Security and Disaster Management Limited, a consultancy company that offers specialist legal and non-legal expertise across a broad range of security and disaster risk management issues. She's also co-chairing the American Society of International Law's Disaster Law Interest Group, and she's a consultant for the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in the terrorism prevention branch. And before she did all of this, she was the associate professor in global security and disaster law at Reading University in the UK. She is basically a pioneer in a field of disaster law, and she designed, while she was at Reading, some of the leading and actually the first master's degree programs focused on disaster law. So we all look up to her. I'm just about myself, a word. I belong to this institution. I teach at the Lauder School of Government, and I'm a senior researcher at the ICT, and that will be enough for now. And I just published a book on underground warfare. I'll give you that one.
Available
at Oxford University Press and on Amazon.com. I can also get you a discount. Now, Professor Lauta, the floor is yours. You go this way. I'll go the other.
How am I? Walter, I need you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kristian, and I'm looking so much forward to engage with you in the next couple of hours. I was told I was starting because I'm the most meta person here, and I hope not to disappoint you. I am a university scholar. I will try to be very concrete as we go along, but if it gets boring or too theoretical, please do let me know. I'm going to talk about a shift in the way we think about how we manage disasters. And as part of the usual disclaimers, I should say that I'm going to talk about kind of broad social science, though I'm a lawyer. So sorry about that. And I am also not an expert on terror, but I'll try to mix in a few references here and there. How do this one? Cheers. Okay, I have the most magnificent view from my hotel room. I don't know if everyone is staying at the Sharon Hotel, but I'm on the 11th floor, and from my balcony, I can see the most beautiful Mediterranean coastline ever. But for me, as a disaster scholar, I don't see the beauty or the serenity of that coastline. I'm thinking about if I were to secure that coastline from seawater rises, from a tsunami, what kind of knowledge would I need? Who would I need to talk to? What kind of strategies would I need to develop to do so? Which actors would I have to engage with to actually get this to be an effective strategy? And how would I finance it? Who would I have to convince to actually leverage a real investment in changing this serene, beautiful coast? As you can already guess, I would at least have to talk with engineers, thinking about how some sort of defense work would actually shield the citizens of Tel Aviv. I would have to talk to economists about what the implications for tourism would be. I would probably have to talk to the State Department as well, because making something here in Tel Aviv will change the landscape down south and up north, potentially for other countries, at least for other municipalities. I would have to talk to politicians at all sorts of levels. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. The complexity of making decisions about disaster risk, and how these decisions have probably changed during the last 30 years, and what that prompts of us in terms of governing such risks. I have 3 steps. It's very easy. The first step is to say disasters are social. For those of you who are familiar with disaster studies, this will not be novel at all. For the rest, it will bring you up to speed. The second argument is that social is messed up, and it's getting worse. We'll talk about that. And the third part is where the real novelty comes into this, is to think about what it means for the way we govern or manage disasters, and ultimately how we regulate disasters. How do we create laws, governance systems, institutions capable of managing these challenges? Okay, are you good with that? Okay, here we go. So, most of you are probably familiar with the Haiti earthquake. Happening in January 2010, an earthquake near Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, caused the death of, well, some say over 200,000 people when it hit the capital. What is perhaps less known to not disaster aficionados is that an earthquake happened a fortnight later in Chile. The distance from the capital was not much different than it was in Haiti, but less than 500 people died. Can anyone tell me the difference? Oh, and I should say that the earthquake hitting Chile was 500 times stronger than the earthquake hitting Haiti. Can anyone tell me the reason for that? That a 500 times stronger earthquake with approximately the same proximity to a social system causes such difference in its effects? Well, building codes. Boom. What else? Preparation. Anything else? Density of population. Assistance to victims. Right. Disaster memory. Good. Anything else? So while Haiti was more than 100 years ago since you had the last strong earthquake, you had a recent memory in Chile of how to deal with earthquakes, and thereby it was a living practice. All of the things you're mentioning now, which describes what actually is a disaster, because a disaster has nothing to do with an earthquake. It's about how many people dies, what are the social effects. It's all social processes, right? It's about justice, poverty. It's about how we build our cityscapes. It's fundamentally also about how we build our institutions, how well prepared we are. It's nothing to do with nature. It's about men and women and the way we build our societies. This is common knowledge within disaster research. This is the so-called PAR model, the pressure and release model. It describes how disaster happens. Basically, the idea is that risk is hazard times vulnerability. And while the hazard obviously plays a role, hazards here being earthquakes, high winds, could be terrorists, I guess, volcanic eruptions, landslides, droughts, whatever you could imagine, disease. We're going to hear a lot about that later, so germs. What's really important, these social scientists say, is not that. It's good. But for the last 100 years, we've become pretty good at predicting what actually happens over there. Some of it will still be a mystery, but even that we can prepare for. What's important is what's on the other side. It's what actually causes us to be vulnerable, fragile towards these conditions, which are part of our natural environment. They say this works in three layers. Let's not go way too deep into that, but the point is that we can go deeper and deeper, and we can kind of end up with it becoming questions of justice and power and structures and so on. Basically, all questions for law and society, I would say, and ethics, and not so much questions for engineers. Sorry to all the engineers here. I know you're good. Okay. Thus far, thus good. Disasters are social. The way we have to understand why a disaster hits a society is not about natural hazards. It's about the way we've constructed the society. And the most effective way of preventing disasters is through the social system as well. If a small earthquake hits Tokyo, nothing will happen. If a similar earthquake hits Copenhagen, Denmark, we're all going to die. We have absolutely no preparedness for it. I had a conversation, this is being recorded, I'm sorry to the Danish Geological Institute for this bad commercial for Denmark and earthquakes. But we don't really prepare for earthquakes. And it makes sense, of course we don't, because we don't have earthquakes. But you know, the example still stands. Good. Thus far, thus good. This kind of socialization of disaster, I think, is so bloody extreme that even after this disaster, the Fukushima, the 3/11 East Japan earthquake in 2011, the third biggest earthquake ever registered by a seismograph happened just east of the Japanese coast. It triggered a tsunami that was 20.5 meters high when it hit the coast, and it traveled more than 12 kilometers inland. Can you imagine that kind of natural forces? Even after this disaster, the Parliamentary Commission set to evaluate the response called this a disaster made in Japan. The main reasons they said for the catastrophic outcome of the disaster was Japanese culture, obedience, the lack of improvisation, the lack of asking critical questions. So again, even in the most extreme display of natural forces, disasters are social. Good. You buy this, right? So this is the case today. Why are all these disasters happening? Tell me, what's the Weather Channel? You know why they're happening. Don't be like that. Good. The second part of the argument is this. So we've now realized that it's the social system we need to work through in order to prevent disasters. The problem is we've kind of also messed up the social system significantly over the last couple of years. This is a flowchart I found of critical infrastructure interdependencies in case of cyber terrorism. But obviously, these critical infrastructure interdependencies would be for any kind of hazard, any kind of threat, right? Any of these fundamental structures hit by either a natural hazard, terrorist attack, or anything else would affect the rest of the fundamental infrastructures of society in accordance with this flowchart. We've made ourselves vulnerable to a degree never seen before by building our society to a level of efficiency where everything is interconnected. You can even do it remotely. All of these things have now been tied together through the internet. So it's even possible to go online and do something about any of these infrastructures and mess up our societies in a similar way. They did, I did a little study of what actually would happen to Copenhagen if we had a 1,000-year flood event, and realized that because of these infrastructure interdependencies, our metro would be out for approximately 3 years. We probably wouldn't have water, clean water, for 2 months. So while this is super effective and very good for a lot of reasons, this makes us more efficient, makes us more differentiated, makes us go to work every day and not have to have our own well and our own electricity supply. It also makes us incredibly vulnerable to natural hazards, and it makes it incredibly difficult to govern these areas. And it's not only a matter of staying within national boundaries. When the Thailand floods of 2011 happened, there was a drop of the world market of 1.2%. You could literally see how supply chains was destroyed by the Thailand floods. So disasters is not only something that happens within your national borders or within your municipality. It can be something that happens in Thailand, for heaven's sake, and it has effects on your company, on your institution, or on your municipality. Good. So much for the second argumentative step. Let's get to the third one. So the way we've tried to manage disasters in the last 40 years, I guess it's fair to say, is by following this model. It's a pretty logical model. I guess we can start from the disaster and say you start by responding to the disaster. Then you have to recover. You're kind of rebuilding your houses. Then there is a mitigation phase where you think about what did we learn? Maybe we should change the building code. Should we have not so high houses? Whatever. And then you go into preparedness when the next alarm sounds. Better get the people mobilized, get them evacuated, and so on, and so on, and so on. And this has led to an increasing professionalization across the world of disaster managers. We have, in every decent country in the world now, people working dedicatedly only with disaster management, and they are good. They're very good at what they do. Incredible, actually. If you look at, oh, that's not good. Can I go back? Okay, this was a graph at one point. Doesn't matter. I don't think we can solve it. But what this beautiful graph very convincingly showed you was how, since 1990, the number of disasters in the world has more than tripled. The number of people dying in disaster is approximately the same as in 1990. And there was a big shift in the 90s where we actually started putting resources into developing disaster management across the world. Bangladesh is the famous example. The floods of the 90s were kind of this horrific example of thousands and thousands of people dying. And then UN came in and developed a disaster management culture, meaning that almost nobody, well, they do still have a third of Bangladesh flooded every year. So, but they're getting much better, right? So disaster management works. The problem is, though, that in order to take the next step, we need to rethink how we get the rest of these numbers down. How do we actually mitigate the actual disasters happening? And for the last 4 years, I've been part of an EU project investigating just that. We've been in 4 countries. We've been doing 6 case studies in European countries, basically going through everything they're doing, making interviews with public officials, with civil society people, with institutions, with experts, trying to figure out what are the gaps presently, what should we do to be better at this. And what we could identify from these 6, I just need to say this, the Sendai framework, which is the 15-year agreement, global agreement for disasters, has a priority saying that we should move to governance. I'm now going to tell you what it means. Okay, I forgot about that. Boom. So, basically, we identified 5 things that are gaps across Europe in the present disaster management system. One is knowledge. In very concrete terms, you need a lot of data, and you need very different kinds of data, and you need people who understand different kinds of data. You need people who both know something about engineering and economics And often you don't have that in a disaster management agency for obvious reasons, because what you basically have been doing your entire life is responding, recovering, mitigating, and recovering, and preparing, and not focusing on the broader governance functions necessary to think how this was. Capacities. While we're very, very good at having blue sirens and water hoses, we're incredibly good at fighting fires. We're very, very bad in terms of kind of expert capacities, figuring out who to talk to, of having and knowing what capacities are, right? Which agency has that thing that we need now? Something you would be surprised how many times people are acquiring things from the neighboring country rather than just calling their neighboring ministry. Stakeholders, new kinds of stakeholders. We've seen volunteers in mass numbers engaging the last couple of years. How do you involve them? Both internally, so how do you coordinate between institutions, and externally? How do you talk to people on the ground? How do you make them do what they actually have to do, rather than being just an obscure hindrance for your disaster management efforts? Scale of investment. So if you want to do something about the coastline of Tel Aviv, it doesn't really work to think 5 years ahead or 20 years ahead. You need to think 500 years ahead if you can, right? Because if you're making an investment now in terms of disaster risk, very rare, high impact events, you want to do it all at once. You don't want to spend a little money to be secure for half of the threats and then accepting that Tel Aviv will be wiped out by the next tsunami when it happens. So scale of investment is changing by this knowledge. And finally, the way we communicate, social media, who we communicate to has changed. Okay, I'm probably running out of time. I'm sorry, I got carried away. I was sure this was going to take 15 minutes. We've developed this model that you can take it, you can run with it. As a kind of a way that local authorities, organizations, and others can actually work with these different things. And it comes with concrete recommendations for each of these. The point is that we need to start thinking in the narrow circle of the next disaster. And we need to think in how do we bring in the governance expertises that we already have in our systems to be ready not for the next disaster, but to engage with the processes that leads to disasters. And that requires a constant exercise of following what we call the SHIELD model. Sharing knowledge, harmonizing capacities, institutionalizing coordination, engaging stakeholders, leveraging investments, and developing communication. And I'm totally in the panel gonna go into each of these and explain you exactly what they are. But I'm also very much out of time. Thank you so much for listening. This is the way you should totally go home and govern your organization. Thanks.
Can we make the slides available? I think so, yes? Kristian, that's okay with you? Yes, certainly. So I'm going to follow on to Kristian Lauder's very enlightening presentation with a bit of a departure. The idea of the panel is that Kristian provided a conceptual overview of the disaster system and the reasons in which it may need to be fixed because it's broken. We're now going to talk in a couple of particular ways about how terrorism and disaster have common attributes in terms of impact, and how in those two cycles, one involving cyber, one of the very good examples that Kristian used, and the other, the health system that Pinchas and Daphné will speak about later, only then for Katja to come tie everything up neatly with a ribbon later this afternoon. You remember what I said at the outset of the panel, which is that terrorism commonly produces effects in society that mirror natural disasters. The examples that Kristian used about Tel Aviv, while horrific, are exemplary, I think, in that way. And if we begin to look at the two phenomena with parallel lens, and we begin to fix systemically our approaches to both, I think will be better counterterrorism preparedness as well. With regard to critical infrastructure, that slide several back in Kristian's deck. I won't bother to recall it. It made me dizzy to look at it, but it was a very illustrative slide about the difficulties of one aspect of critical infrastructure protection. The challenges that are facing us in protecting critical infrastructure are by and large not technological, but they're instead legal and political. I'll stand by that. I mean it. Lawyers and academics can't do much to solve the political, but perhaps we can make a better set of resolutions about the legal boundaries and approaches toward effective disaster and counterterrorism response. Law actually gets in the way often of effective counterterrorism and disaster response in many circumstances, largely because of failures of foresight and planning. We can show the way, I think, toward more effective disaster response and implementation of societal resources that will prepare us in more effective ways for both kinds of occurrences. Imagine a scenario. Bear with me for a moment while I sketch out a scenario that is more dull than the Tel-Aviv scenario that Kristian outlined before. But put us somewhere in Europe. Let's say not Copenhagen. Sorry. But not in Israel either. Imagine afternoon rush hour in a major European city on a hot and steamy September day, and the city is hit with a massive blackout. The electric grid is crippled. Backup generators resume the most critical operations in hospitals and other critical care centers, but all other activities that depend upon electricity have come to a sudden halt. Government and private industrial security experts quickly discover that the software and malware that has accessed supervisory control and data acquisition controls, those are called SCADA systems, many of you know this phrase. These are the systems that supervise data over dispersed components of the electric grid and which are connected to the global internet. Kristian also made reference to these in his comments. In recent years, industry reports that a few laptops containing information on how to access SCADA controls were stolen from utility companies in Europe and the United States. During the same period, computers that have been seized from terrorist captives contain similar narrative descriptions about SCADA. Officials estimate that the cyber attacks have done long-term damage to critical system components and have rendered useless generators and other equipment that must be replaced where no backup replacement equipment is standing by. Even rudimentary repairs will take weeks or months, and full system capabilities may not be restored for more than a year. The economic losses will be in the billions of dollars, and millions of lives will be disrupted for a long time. The software and malware that were used to infect the grid, bring it down, were programmed to trigger the blackout at a predetermined time. The attacks were not attributed. That's important. Although intelligence and law enforcement experts trace the dissemination of the attacks to computers in South Asia, the only other available intelligence comes from those seized laptops from terrorist captives. The governments of Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran have denied any involvement in the attacks, and no intelligence points to their involvement so far. Known terrorist organizations have shown interest in cyber capabilities, as we know, and the seized laptops suggest that some steps were taken to acquire them. So here we are, end of scenario. It's depressing, but it's realistic. So experts believe that carrying out a cyber attack of that magnitude would be difficult but not impossible. Would require considerable planning and resources and a team with a broad set of skills. All of those things are capable of being done. The power grid has long been considered a prime target for a devastating cyber attack. Again, Kristian made reference to some of these characteristics. Terrorist groups, criminal organizations, and foreign security services and their proxies are capable of waging such an attack. Here again then is the confluence of terrorism and disaster. The digital systems that control the critical infrastructure in most countries are easily penetrated due to their weak and dated architecture. Architecture is an important concept here. You can think of the architectural characteristics of the electric grid. While efforts have been made in many parts of the world, including in Europe and the United States, to improve attack discovery and response, improve information sharing, create security operations centers, the security of the underlying network remains vulnerable and very unstable. Particularly in the United States, but to some extent this is true in most countries, such security standards as exist for the electric grid are voluntary, not mandatory. They're industry standards, implemented and supported and enforced, if at all, by industry groups. Nor does compliance with the existing standards, where there are some, mean that the systems are secure. For example, US government agencies have encouraged privately held critical infrastructure to improve network security, but a recent report by the Governmental Accounting Office, arm of the US Congress, reported that relatively little has been done in 2018. Meanwhile, system operators and policy proposals have tended to focus on short-term fixes and tactical improvements, such as marginally better tools for attack discovery and response. Here we go again. Setting up security operations centers where none existed before. Information sharing, all well and good. And of course, more and better training, also all to the good. But this is a losing game. Critical infrastructure is less secure now than it was 15 years ago. Isn't that remarkable, given all the strides that we've made in so many areas? Meanwhile, key government agencies have worked hard to encourage better infrastructure security, but the efforts have not altered and cannot alter the dismal strategic balance in which the defense, that is, nation states, hold the short end of the stick, and in which weak nations, eventually any non-nation state actor, can harm more powerful nations at painful levels that are intentionally below the level of armed conflict. The lawyers in the room know why that reference is important, but let me briefly explain. The reason for our project, I won't say it, 12 years ago, was that we were frustrated that the laws of armed conflict did not often apply in conflict with non-state actors. How could we adjust to make them so? One of the other problems that cyber in the hands of terrorists presents is that their harm most of the time is not kinetic. It doesn't kill people directly or even damage property. The rush hour blackout that I described in the major European city, if it was allowed to go on for some time, would certainly harm some people and would certainly cause tremendous economic loss and disruption for a long time, but it might not, and likely in the beginning would not, rise to the level of an armed conflict. We would not have been attacked and allow for a kinetic response, assuming we could identify the perpetrator. Remember, there's no attribution of the attack so far. So the defense has the upper hand right now. And the non-state terrorists and the small states that have the capabilities to wage cyber operations against the more powerful are in a very strategically advantaged position. The underlying problem is that the owners and operators of critical infrastructure have aggressively aggregated data and linked functions without regard to long-term risk. As Kristian said in his presentation, it was efficient. We worked very well in the early years of internet and digitization to make our systems linked and efficient so that they would be accessible to so many. And that has undoubtedly brought great benefits to society. They also retrofitted industrial technology with digitized controls that were exposed to the internet. Very smart in the short term. The control for a railroad track switch, for example, or a power generation plant used to be locked up before the internet. It's not locked up anymore. Neither are locked up anymore. They're amenable to a hack. They're reachable and potentially controllable electronically from many places on Earth. And the efficiencies, the linkage created for managing distributed technologies were very immediate and obvious, but the vulnerabilities, while immediate, weren't so obvious to people who are not particularly computer literate. We say geeks. All right. They're now obvious, I think, to nearly everyone, but they're no longer deniable either. So a combined cyber and physical attack on the electric grid. We've had some premonitions of this in the United States, an attack with kinetic weapons, say on a substation, combined with a cyber attack on other parts of the grid, could do even greater damage. That's been worried about more and more lately. And if that was allowed to, if that did happen, there could be widespread fatalities and injuries as well. Kristian mentioned the possibility of an air collision without the availability of air traffic control, breakdowns in control systems, air traffic or otherwise on the ground, railroads and the like could bring devastating consequences. I don't want to get into movie land here, but I think we've talked enough about the possible risks here. So I think I've made my point. Whether perpetrated by a state adversary, which is something that we need to be very concerned about, or by a terrorist group, a critical component of an assault on a central part of our critical infrastructure is to spread fear among the people, to cause them to question whether their government can and will protect them. The scenario fits the terrorism playbook to a T, it seems to me, and if the blackout takes out core components of the grid, the symptoms of fear and distrust of government could worsen and spread. On that happy note, I'll stop. Daphné, would you like to continue now, or would you want to take a break?
I don't know. I think this might be an hour.
No, why don't we go on? You'll lighten the mood somewhat.
I'm not sure about that at all.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that at all.
I'm not sure I'm going to enlighten. Actually, probably not. But anyway, because we're looking at different types of disasters, different types of terrorist attacks, and we're focusing here on, we had Professor Banks' presentation on cyber. I'm going to be speaking more about health disasters and health and bioterrorism, essentially. But before that, I want to actually talk a bit about the picture, the Tel Aviv picture, and it really takes home a point about how the fact that here in Israel, the kind of questions that you reflect upon when you see the Tel Aviv coastline, I don't think that they are the questions that people ask themselves, and I'll tell you why. So on Monday morning, as part of this conference, and Kristian, you weren't here yet, so I'm not, don't take it as a, but I was on a panel with General Yair Golan, who's a candidate to the position of IDF Chief of Staff, and he mentioned that Israel is well prepared for future emergencies. that 80% of the population has access to nearby shelters. I don't know if this is an accurate figure or not, but this is not important for now. He said, we're not Japan, okay? But we can be very proud of our resilience as a nation. So now the question, well prepared for what? Well prepared for the questions you were asking, resilient for what? Of course, he was not talking about the questions that you were asking. He's talking about war, he's talking about military operations, because this is what we are concerned about here in Israel, in this very nice little corner of the world. And we have plenty of options. We are with Lebanon, with Syria, with Daesh, with Hezbollah, with Hamas. So basically, there are so many options for open hostilities and attacks, whether it's a full-on war or terrorism or whatever it is, that it leaves very little time and energy for thinking about other types of threats, okay? Because we have to deal with rockets and tunnels and kites and balloons. So national emergencies that can have actually equally devastating effects, but that don't fit within this very narrow kind of understanding of what security means and this military and strategic framework that we don't think about. And if you actually reflect upon it for more than just a second, you realize that these other emergencies that we're not talking about all of them today because we're focusing on cyber and health, but even we're talking about earthquake, and I know Magen is working very hard to actually prepare for the next earthquake here, which they think will happen. But in general, they are pretty much alone doing that. But if we think about it, these other types and roots of insecurity could have even more widespread effect here, because they would not be just limited to Israel, but rather they would spread to other countries. They could affect the entire region. There are a lot of fragile states in this region of the world as well, so they could bring those fragile states on the brink of basically a governance breakdown. And the geopolitical impact as a whole could be even greater than, I don't want to say just a war in Israel, because I live here and I don't feel that way, but I'm really trying to take quite a critical approach to that. So, but if we do broaden our view of what security means, and if we think about it more as people security and maybe less as state security, or we think about the roots of insecurity as broader set of determinants than just military and strategic. So like we talked here about a couple of different disasters, and it could be a typhoon, it could be an earthquake, it could be a flu epidemic, it could be a cyber attack on a water plant. Basically what we're looking at is a situation that puts a country, a situation that gives the feeling to the leadership and the people of a sense of being out of control, right, of panic, of insecurity. And then the authorities end up in a situation where they are having challenges, making decisions, coordinating assistance to affected population, and they have dilemmas, and this is basically the point, what we're mostly trying to nail here, which is what they are putting them in front of dilemmas, the leadership and the decision makers, as to what is the proper legal toolkit applicable, or even forget applicable, because we're willing to be a bit flexible in our understanding of this, but what is maybe the most appropriate legal toolkit to handle this emergency. So like I said, I'll talk about health disasters, and I want to try to answer the following question. As a matter of law and policy, how should domestic and international actors approach health disasters? And I'll speak a bit about health disasters, but this is the main question, right? How should we approach it as a matter of law and policy? And I'll argue two things, and one of them I think I've already kind of approached now, which is, number one, we have to take a broad view of what security means, okay? And if we're talking about health specifically, security means health. It means public health, and here I look at it more as like the domestic aspect of public health, but it also means global health, because in the end, those health issues I'm about to touch upon, they again have an impact way beyond borders, right? They don't stop at our borders. So it's public health, it's global health, and states are increasingly willing, by the way, to incorporate both public health and global health as part of their national security agendas. Health as a foreign policy issue, or health as a national security issues, this is something that both the United States has adopted, the United Kingdom has adopted. This is something that the UN has been promoting for decades, since the 1990s. So this is not something new, but I think when we're looking about it and speaking about this, especially in Israel, is very important. So that's the first point. The second point is I want to advocate, and this is, again, part of what this article that we wrote together with Professor Banks and Katya Samuel as well. I want to advocate a multi-hazard approach to health disasters. And I hope to clarify what I mean by that in a few minutes, okay? But let's go back to health disasters for a moment and try to center ourselves in a not much happier environment than we talked about until now. Tsunami and cyber, and so health is again, places states in a situation that can easily, totally spur out of control. Decisions need to be made quickly, every minute counts. There's a need for vaccines that need to be administered extremely quickly, okay, and of course Professor Halpern knows much more about this than I do. The death toll can rise very sharply in a very few hours following the initial contamination if those vaccines are not being administered, and sometimes vaccines can also run out, and then you need to turn to other states or to the international community to get more. Meanwhile, of course, you need to be careful about movement, transborder movement, because your initial contamination can spread to neighboring countries. And at the same time as all of this is already going on, the health professionals are put in a very dire situation because they need to try to figure out what are the symptoms that people are demonstrating and identify what are the patterns, the life patterns that these people share in order to try to deal with it. And the longer it takes for the health professionals to recognize the symptoms and to recognize those patterns, the more dangerous, of course, and lethal the crisis will be. So there's no doubt that a health disaster or health crisis or health emergency can easily turn into a global and catastrophic event if the pieces don't easily and well fit together. Now, let's try to zoom in a little bit, and this is going to get us to the part about terrorism. There are basically, and I really am simplifying, but just for the sake of argument, two main types of health disasters, okay? Those that occur naturally and those that are triggered by the actions of men, of people, malicious use of bacteria, virus, biological agent, otherwise known as bioterrorism. So let's talk a bit about the naturally caused health disasters. They can occur sometimes in the wake of a natural disaster, like an earthquake, when sanitation conditions are not great, when waste management is not in perfect shape, and very importantly, when water becomes contaminated or the sources are compromised. This happened in the Balkans in 2014. There were major flooding there, and animals were floating in the water for days, and the risk of diseases was very high. And similarly, we saw this also in 2018, this year, in Kenya with the overflowing of the Tana River. Again, experts being very worried about malaria or cholera spreading in the region. And right now we have a crisis in the Congo as well, where experts are worried that actually the conflict will lead to an increase in the spread of Ebola. So Ebola crisis is another example. The SARS outbreak in southern China in 2003 is yet another example. And even in the United States of America, the bird flu, the H5N1 bird flu of 2009 also created some very serious challenges. And all of these are natural, what I call natural disasters. Of course, it's not that they're completely independent from the action of and the decisions that people make, but they are not maliciously, intentionally caused. Which brings us to a second category, which is those that are actually intentionally provoked and result directly from man's actions. And in this case, of course, you have someone taking a positive step to cause the outbreak of the disease. And this is the kind of health disasters or health situations that are commonly referred to as bioterrorism. Examples, one well-known example is, of course, the anthrax attacks post 9/11, this white powder sent into the envelopes and that killed a few people in the United States. But a less known example, which I found quite interesting, is an outbreak of salmonella disease in 1984 in Oregon, because some group wanted to influence the local elections and intentionally contaminated salad bars in Oregon with salmonella. You heard about this?
Yeah.
You must be the only one. But that's actually an example of a purposefully putting the salmonella into the food. What's important about this bioterrorism is, and perhaps not always so easily known or understood, is that there's no need to actually use a biological agent. And if you think about it, even this kind of intentional health disaster can be caused, and I go back to the cyber, it could be caused by a cyber attack or it can follow or flow from a cyber attack on a water plant or an electrical grid as well. But it can also be a conventional strike on the water plant or on the electrical grid. So in that case, you would have the health disaster as kind of like a secondary effect as opposed to constituting the primary attack. Okay, but if we try to compare a little bit between cyber and health disasters, the cyber attacks, they are always intentionally provoked, right? You don't do a cyber attack, it doesn't happen naturally. You have to do it. There has to be a human behind it that actually initiates it. And so that's a major difference with health disasters that can really cover such a wide array of circumstances, and that makes them actually difficult to deal with. So there's differences between the two, of course. In terms of the policy and legal level, okay, so how do we approach health disasters? There's basically mainly two ways to do this. One of them is to use the security counterterrorism paradigm, and that would most of the time be the case for when the attack is a bioterrorist attack, right? When there's an intentionally provoked attack, when there's a malicious intent, then it would be looked at as a national security crisis, and the national security paradigm, the counterterrorism efforts and mechanisms will be put in place. The other way to look at this is, and this happens mostly when the health disaster is not maliciously provoked, when it's a natural one, then you'd use what Kristian was mentioning before, which is the disaster risk reduction paradigm, right? Which is framed around these components that you talked about: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. If it's an Ebola epidemic, or if it's a flu, or if it's a pandemic, then this is usually the type of paradigm that states will look to. Well, what I want to suggest is that this may not be the best way to look at health disasters for a number of reasons, and I think it doesn't actually properly account for either types of health disasters. But since we're in a counterterrorism conference, of course, when dealing with even bioterrorism, right, we need to kind of learn a little bit about how we do disaster risk reduction in other contexts. So why do I think this is not the best way to look at health disasters? One reason is that and then again, Professor Halpern can correct me on this, is that when you have a contamination, okay, health professionals and will not always have it easy determining whether this was intentionally provoked or a natural. Okay, if it's smallpox, it would be pretty obvious that someone did it, okay, because smallpox has basically been eradicated, so you'd have to have really someone using it voluntarily. But a lot of other outbreaks are difficult to tell whether they are bioterrorism or whether they are just a natural outbreak. And there was an outbreak of the West Nile virus in New York in 1999, and I know that then the authorities truly struggled in trying to figure out, is this a natural health disaster or is this bioterrorism? So that's one reason. And there's another reason, which is the priorities of health professionals versus the priorities of national security experts in the wake of such a crisis are very different. What do health professionals want to do? They want to stop contamination. That's, I think, number one, stop the spread of the disease, and care for those that are affected. They do want to know the cause, but I'm not sure it's the top of their list in terms of priorities. In the counterterrorism context, and if we look through that paradigm at the crisis, then the priority would definitely be trying to attribute responsibilities, because that's what we're mostly concerned about, and punishing the perpetrators. That would be a major concern. And finally, what we can see is that as part of the security and counterterrorism response, there's not a whole lot of emphasis placed on prevention, on mitigation, on preparedness, on response. This is not the culture of national security and counterterrorism paradigms. So this is why we wanted to suggest actually an alternate path, which would apply to all health disasters, okay, whether they are naturally caused or whether they are intentionally provoked. And this may not, of course, we're not arguing for a full merging of all the paradigms, but at least learning from the disaster risk reduction paradigm to try to help deal with these broader health emergencies. Bring the paradigms closer and try to think about this as one type of emergencies as opposed to differentiate on what was the intent, what was the reason behind it. And see, this brings me to the Sendai framework, which Kristian didn't have a chance to talk about very much. But there's something called a document called the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, which can come in very handy when dealing with these kind of emergencies. So what is the Sendai Framework? It was adopted by the United Nations at the 3rd UN World Conference in Sendai in Japan in 2015. It was the outcome of some consultations between various stakeholders under the auspices of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and at the request of the UN General Assembly. So why is the Sendai framework such an opportunity for thinking both about bioterrorism and to speak about national health or global health emergencies like Ebola or others? So number one, it has a focus on disaster risk management, so managing the risk as opposed to managing the disaster itself. So it kind of like forces you to think ahead as to how you manage your risk as opposed to just dealing with the disaster when it happens. That's one element about the Sendai framework that's very attractive. It's also a global framework, okay? It has a very broad appeal and subscribers. It has also a very broad scope in a sense that in ab initio, if you want, or as a matter of principle, this Sendai framework actually applies to all types of disasters, okay? Whether they are naturally caused or intentionally caused. So it already takes that approach, even though it doesn't specifically apply it to health disasters. And so it takes this, what I called and what I named earlier, this multi-hazard approach to disaster. Disaster can be caused by a multitude of different hazards and different causes and routes. And in fact, the Sendai framework recognizes that there is an inherent there's an interconnectiveness between the different causes and routes behind a disaster. It's not just climate change or just a natural, or infectious disease just appearing suddenly. No, maybe it's the rising temperatures that led to the mosquito being more resilient, and that in turn is what is making Ebola difficult to fight. So it doesn't focus on intent or causation, but it looks at the disaster as at the outcome of the disaster and at the crisis itself. It also puts a very strong emphasis on health resilience, so that obviously speaks a lot, and that emphasis is important for dealing with health emergencies. And finally, and this is really, I'm getting to my last point, what the Sendai framework does is that it involves all actors and all sectors in the response and in the preparedness of these emergencies. So by doing that, and this is mostly in terms, again, of taking from the Sendai framework what the elements about prevention and response, a framework that has been welcomed by states, that has been endorsed by the UN, that has been embraced by the EU. So it's not really challenged, and it can offer a very important outlet and avenue for thinking better and preparing better, improving early warning systems for all types of health emergencies, including those that are intentionally caused, including bioterrorism. So I don't know if that's more optimistic or maybe a little bit, but that's kind of the idea that I thought we'd put out there. Yeah, okay.
Sorry? I do. So, good afternoon. I will try to provide you with a brief overview of the preparedness of Israel for terrorism and war as sort of an example of what I would say is sort of different than what Daphné just said, which is the so-called all hazards approach. In the disaster community, the all hazards approach has been sort of a watchword in the last, 15, 20 years or so. And this is about the time that I've come into disaster management, the medical aspect of disaster management. And over the years, I've become fairly convinced that this is a somewhat problematic approach. It started off with people talking about disparate disasters requiring totally different responses, and then everybody sort of said, let's come together, there's basic principles that need to be approached. And as you talk about disasters, especially as you manage disasters on the medical aspect as I do, then you find that the differences are so significant that sometimes mixing different types of disasters together beyond the principles can become an issue in itself. So again, what I'll try to do is provide you with this example of the Israel preparedness system for terrorism and war, and use this to discuss that maybe, or as an opening for that discussion. Also, for another issue which I think is very important to discuss, which is the duty of the government, of its various institutions, and of the individual citizen to prepare for disaster and to make themselves ready to cope with disasters. Okay, so without further ado, Israel is a small country. We have 28 general hospitals. They tend to be very, very large because we're geographically small, so it does make sense to have lots of small hospitals throughout the country. We have 6 regional, 6 level 1 trauma centers, but we do have a, thank you, we do have a geographic distribution of the hospital system. And we are in a rather unique situation. There are many more, thank God, attacks in Kabul and in Baghdad than there are in Israel. But not much research comes out of there. There are many more major disasters in less developed countries, economically developed countries, than Israel. Not much research comes out of that there either. Israel is in that sort of meeting ground of a country that's been under a certain type of disaster preparedness, not tsunamis, for many, many years, yet has a highly developed academic and medical sector that is able to, and actually wishes to, produce lots of research and publications. So if you look at the publications about disaster, in the medical literature at least, we are disproportionately represented there. So we've had a learning curve that we've gone through, and we still are going through, but it's been fairly steep. Therefore, there's been significant refinement of the medical system, at least, which is the one I deal with, over the years of preparedness. This is my own hospital, about 20 kilometers from here, the Tel-Aviv Medical Center. It's a rather large university hospital, which has dealt with about 40 terrorist incidents in the last 12 or 13 years. If you look at these terrorist incidents such as London, Madrid, Paris, there are very few hospitals, there are very few individual physicians or individual disaster managers there who have ever dealt with more than 2 events. And this usually over many years. My doctors, myself, I've managed about 36 of these events in the hospital. So we have accumulated experience that way. And terrorism in Israel is very personal sometimes. This is my own daughter with my granddaughter. She was 3 days old, the granddaughter was, when she first had to take shelter in our own bomb shelter in our own house because of rockets falling around us. So I've talked about the topics I wanted to discuss and some major issues that need to be addressed. How does one make society resilient around disasters? And disasters come in many shapes and forms. The one I'm talking about are repeated attacks, either by warring nations around us or by terrorists over prolonged periods of time, causing significant stress on the population. And the other is, how does one make the medical system ready to cope with disasters, what we call in medical terminology surge capacity, being able to take suddenly large numbers of patients into a system that was not built to begin with to do that. And then there's the issue of responsibility that I've alluded to. Who is responsible to make sure that society is resilient and that it has surge capacity? Who's accountable if we fail? And should we regulate what needs to be done? And should then do we need to use those regulations to hold people accountable if they failed in what the regulation told them they should have done? I'll just give you a few brief examples. During the last Gaza war or mini-war, call it what you will, Sderot, which is a little town on the border of Gaza, treated 1,000 residents for stress-related conditions. In fact, if you were to go delve deeply into the situation of the population that month and a half of war, probably 80% of the population would have needed treatment. Is it the government's role to not only provide care to those who seek it, but actually go in and provide support to those who have not been able to seek it or who elected to not seek it because there are so many more victims. 1/3 of the children of Sderot are diagnosed with PTSD. And this is why. It's very stressful. And this is my own granddaughter's kindergarten, which has a bomb shelter, as all kindergartens in Israel do. And this is the government doing its job of making sure that they are protected, and that I, as a grandfather and my children, feel safer because she is better protected. And this is how our pre-hospital system has managed to make things work, by sending lots of EMTs to every event, like more than 100, lots of ambulances, like more than 40 on the average, to every bombing event. The first ambulance is on site within less than 4 minutes. The first casualty is evacuated within about 10 minutes, and the last casualty is evacuated within about 25 minutes. Now, this is vastly different than what happens in most European countries, where it takes about 2 hours to complete evacuation on site. Now, that's not because the medical system there is bad. It is because they have a different philosophy of care. And that can be discussed in the medical community, needs being discussed in the medical community. But my point is that the government has elected to do something, to develop a concept of operations, and has put some backing into that to make that happen. It may be wrong, but this is how we do things. The outcome of that is that while it permits processing large numbers of casualties very, very quickly on site, it means that we, because the response is so quick, we in the hospital need to be ready very, very quickly. In most incidents that happened in Tel Aviv, bombings in Tel Aviv, I had about 5 to 6 minutes advance notice before the first casualty came in, and often none. The first casualty came in and said there's many more coming, pretty much. So we have developed a system that runs its own course. Again, maybe the best, may not be the best one. That's a professional issue. But there is a system in place that was developed with government funding, mandated by government to be developed that way. We are required to maintain a 20% surge capacity within 2 hours. So my ER is able to, and has by law, to be able to receive 300 casualties within 2 hours. And we have received, the biggest event we have had was 160 casualties, but that was within 30 minutes, so that's a fairly significant load. And these are physically designed to cope with major fluxes of patients. When I'm now designing a new ED, 100 beds and so on, a very large one of the issues that we deal with officially, and we're mandated to do that, is designing the disaster preparedness and resilience into the structure. Not all countries have such rules, or even or laws, certainly, but we have both. And this is my current ED, and you can see that the red lines are how we plan and how we actually move patients through the ED efficiently, so that we can receive many, many patients very, very quickly. And the ED was designed that way. So we also developed a unique triage methodology, which is controversial. And in many countries, they use different numbers-based triage systems deciding who gets care first. That's what triage is about. Our system is based on hundreds and thousands of events, and we've decided that this is the system we use. We call it the so-called look, listen, feel system. Basically, count nothing, measure nothing, decide based on your own expertise, on your own medical gestalt, who needs care first. It works for us very well. But again, it's not a medical question. The system got together, learned from what happened, and made a decision that this is the best way for us to function, and then mandated that everyone follow that rule. And this is a computerized patient management system that the government is funding now. This will be in place in about 2 months, meaning that every one of us, physicians, nurses, managing a disaster, will have the ability within our own smartphone to see every patient, every EKG, every X-ray, every CT scan, every lab report of every patient in the ED, because we may not be able to go to a computer or write something up in a disaster, but that will be produced. We can use it in regular operations, and it probably will be used, but the impetus for developing that was disaster. And this is a good example. The government, after much prodding, I must say, said, okay, we need a national patient casualty tracking system. So they put out an RFI, and IBM Raytheon came back with like $2, $3, $4 million, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And the government said, well, that's not what we meant. We didn't want to invest that much money. So the guy from Rambam Hospital up north said, I can do it. And everybody was like, okay, you were Raytheon. But he said, yes, it's really very simple. So we said, okay, you know what? I was in charge of that particular project. So we said, you know what? How much it will cost? I said, I don't know, not much. So 3 months later, $30,000 later, he put together a system which is open source on the internet. 15 years later, it's still fully functional. And we do have a national patient tracking system and an unidentified casualty identification system in place, and it works very well. It hasn't cost a penny since then. It needs no maintenance. And our hospitals have been attacked. I know I have 2 minutes. Our hospitals have been attacked repeatedly, from Lebanon mostly, and from Gaza also. So many hospitals are building underground hospitals now. This is one of the underground garages in my hospital. Within 24 hours, it can be turned into a 750-bed, chemically protected, bomb-protected underground hospital, including dialysis, intensive care, and everything else, in operating rooms. And this is the entrance to the ED, which is a bomb shelter. By law, to all the lawyers here, by law, in Israel, there are 5, within each hospital, there are 5 departments that must be built to bomb shelter standards and chemical attack standards, which are the ER, the delivery room, the operating rooms, the neonatal intensive care unit, and the intensive care unit, general intensive care unit. And we, of course, going beyond that. But this must be, the building codes include building them to this standard. And then finally, there's staff resilience, ourselves. And surprisingly, I must say that when the major terrorist incident started in the early 90s, one of the things we really worried about was, will people be able to cope? Because, you know, the sites are not that pretty, and it happens again and again, and sometimes it's day after day after day after day, so it becomes really a bore. And what we found was, surprisingly, to me, I must say, and I've been a physician for many, many years. I've been through 3 or 4 wars in this country as a soldier, but that was a different kind of war. And what happened was that the resilience of the staff actually surpassed our expectations, and the best thing we did was nothing. We initially, and the government, tried to mandate that, and Magen our national EMS, tried to mandate that for their staff. Everyone going through a bad incident, like a terrorist incident, needs to be debriefed and seen by psychologists, and that needs to be written down, and that needs to be, they go into their personal file and so on. And we're like, wait a second. These people are professionals, they need to cope. And they did, and they do. And I haven't lost a single nurse or a single physician from the ED who has left because they felt that the stress was too much for them. They've left for other reasons, poor pay, and so on, mostly. But lots of them went to other countries because the pay is so much better, but not because of that. And we developed techniques to cope with that. Now, these techniques are developed very often locally, but the government has a system to learn from the caregivers, from the individual institutions, and the army is deeply involved in our culture. So the IDF, the Defense Forces Trauma Branch, has a special section that goes to every hospital after each event, learns, disseminates the lessons learned, and then A few months later, this comes out from the Ministry of Health as a mandatory rule if a decision was made that this is what happened and it went well. So the government is involved in the learning process. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't think we have great government. Okay? I'm not about this one. I'm not going to any politics. Governments in Israel have so many faults I can't even count them. But the issue of disaster preparedness has permeated our culture and has permeated the governmental culture and has become something that you cannot do without. And the government is involved, and the hospitals are involved, and the HMOs are involved, and the hospital manager is involved and has a duty to make sure that his hospital is ready. And I, as a director of a department, am tasked with making sure that my department is ready, and I'm tested every year. Every single year, the government sends a team with a questionnaire that is about 25 pages long, like 500 questions that they ask us and look at issues, and we have to be able to answer in positive to all of them. Or we need to be accountable, and worst of all, what's the biggest thing after that, you think? It's published online. It's published. So it's all transparent. And everybody becomes like, okay, so everybody knows what happened here. So next year we want to be better. And then the government paid us to build underground kindergarten for the children of our staff, because otherwise they would not have been able to come to work with rocket attacks. So I'll try to finish, and the involvement of armed forces is something that has become very normative in this country. I would like to finish with two sort of messages. I think that there are two concepts I'd like to challenge. One, I've started with, the all hazards approach. We have become very, very good at managing terrorism and the ravages of war on the population. This has not in any way, shape, or form made us good at managing or preparing for tsunami, Ebola, earthquakes, or any other type of major, certainly natural disaster. And anyone who thinks that because you've become very good at managing the disasters that you have, you're also good at managing other disasters, because the whole hazards approach indicates that if you prepare correctly for disasters, generically, then you may be ready for all disasters, I think is maybe misleading themselves. And the other issue is the fact that society and individuals cope much better with long-term disasters than one may think. But they cannot be left alone. They need to function and to feel, they need to cope within a framework that gives them the feeling that the government cares, that the institutions they rely on, like municipalities, care, the people around them care and also prepare. It's not left to them alone. I'm willing to buy what I need to buy to prepare my house. But I need to know that if I go online, the government has put up a list that is the best suggestion they could come up with, and they made sure that that doesn't cost too much. That's what I want of them. If I'm told that I need a bomb shelter in my house, I want that to be part of the building code so that it doesn't cost as much, because the people who build houses have to build bomb shelters in their houses, as they do in this country, as of 1991, I think, after the first Gulf War, when I didn't have a bomb shelter, and 39 Scud missiles fell in Tel Aviv and its environs, one of them very close to where I was working at that time. So I think that there are issues that we can talk about, but we need to be very careful about generalizations and about assuming that principles guide base preparedness. In the end, is the little details that the people on the ground work with. And it's the people on the ground who have to cope, and they need to be helped to be able to cope. But it's them that will do the job in the end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much again to Bill and to Daphné for the opportunity to be here for the second year in a row and to continue some of the sort of thinking and discussion that we started last year. And as Bill said at the beginning, I'm going to do a little bit of a sort of mopping up and picking up some of the key themes and progressing some of the thinking, having heard 4 very different but very helpful presentations. So the theme that I want to talk about, and I'm in earlier processes still of the thinking how best to do it, but it's on the theme of looking how law is a dynamic, but it's generally poorly understood, not used as much as it could be, tool of disaster risk mitigation. And my background is that as an international lawyer, I have specialised in security, particularly counter-terrorism, but also in disasters. And one of the issues that I'm interested in is where those 2 different paradigms meet, including conceptually and institutionally, and look at the whole issue of viewing and the potential benefits associated with viewing a terrorist attack as a disaster event, particularly from the view of disaster risk mitigation, and ideally preventing the attack from occurring, or through some of the more informed integrated thinking, mitigating the potential effects that particularly a significant catastrophic style terrorist attack may have. So we've heard different approaches and concept of what a disaster is. Just really want to sort of pick up a little bit more. Daphné introduced the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. Before that was the Hyogo framework, 2005 to 2015. And we've seen a shift, particularly over the last sort of 20 years or so, from disaster response to disaster prevention or mitigation. And one of the notable features about the Sendai framework is it takes a very broad approach to the concept of disasters. So it can be small scale, it can be large scale, it can be something which happens suddenly like an earthquake, it could be something which is a slow onset disaster like a extreme weather event. It could be caused by the term natural. Of course, there's a whole debate about what's completely natural, what has man-made factors, but for the current purposes, natural, man-made, environmental, technological, biological hazards. So very much the approach of the international community is to take a much more broader, integrated approach. So Kristian introduced the concept of the disaster risk management cycle. Just one thing that I'd want to draw out from there was a 4-part of mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, is that within mitigation, sometimes the concept of prevention is viewed as part of mitigation. Sometimes it's viewed as a 5th part of the cycle. And so very much the focus that I have is on the prevention or the mitigating of the disaster impacts. So in terms of what are you trying to achieve with that? Reduction of risk, reduction of vulnerability, looking at issues of capacity, exposure, looking at the different forms of hazards and the different contextual environments. So as part of this sort of movement and trend, so, two key themes that I want to pick up on. One is multi-sectoral approaches. And that's the sort of increased realisation, and it's quite central to the ambitious goals of the Sendai framework, about the need that if we're really going to develop the most innovative, effective, impactful responses possible in terms of disaster risk reduction, is that we need to allow space for more innovative, multi-sectoral collaborations. And that's in no way saying that the existing collaborations are not relevant, that they're not important. In a sense, they're very much the baseline. But it's looking at what more can be done in terms of new partnerships, particularly between the public and the private sector. And part of those collaborations that are referred to is between the scientific, the technological, and the legal sectors. The reality is, though, that that's part of the conversation, at least part of the theory. But I've certainly found as a lawyer, it's difficult to achieve in practice. And part of it is because traditionally there's a very narrow understanding and approach to law as a tool. So generally, law would be regarded as a tool of constraint. It might be a tool of litigation. Often when I mention law, I'm told that the organisation I'm speaking to, it has a legal team who produce contracts and memorandums of understanding. Thank you very much. And as part of this conversation, what I find is that there's significant reports and work which is going on, for example, on cyber risk, on technological developments that are engaging different sectors, but often as part of that conversation, law is not part of the conversation. And I think it's in part because the dynamic nature of law is not fully understood. And actually the responsibility lies two ways. Within the legal community, we've not been very good. One, at ourselves thinking in broader, more multidimensional terms, but also in going out and engaging other sectors. So something that I'm in the sort of early stages of doing, but it is collaborating with scientists, with technology companies, and seeing, where do they have vulnerability? Where can a broader understanding of what legal tools have to offer strengthen the resilience and reduce the vulnerability there? So one thing to say is that in terms of available legal tools, is that there's actually many, many bodies of law which are relevant to disaster management, maybe 20, 30 legal regimes. It could be anything from international disaster law, which is a developing body of law. Part of it is international disaster response law. There's human rights law, international environmental law, where there's transboundary harm. It might be international aviation law, where there's risk, international maritime law. There can be issues to do with the law of the sea and pollution and so forth, and space law and other areas of law relevant to the development of technology. And one of the things which has been touched on is as part of this sort of multi-dimensional risk, is how we broaden that conversation. And one of them is looking at what are some of the key benefits that could be brought. And I just want to touch on a few of them. In terms of an overarching goal and benefits of viewing a terrorist attack as a disaster event, is traditionally, as Daphné and Bill have referred to, there's separate paradigms. There's the security paradigm and generally counter-terrorism. The applicable law there, it would be concerned with crime prevention, with criminal justice responses, and on the disaster risk management side, often the focus has been on preparedness and response. And it's looking at where you have got these quite traditional, conceptual approaches, and in turn they inform how institutions have evolved, is that in their own right, they've been effective in certain scenarios, but where you're looking at a catastrophic terrorist attack, which can be multi-hazard. So as a scenario, if you have an attack on a critical national infrastructure, whether that's been perpetrated by cyber or it's been a kinetic attack, it raises even different legal issues. So the actual attack on the critical national infrastructure, you would be very much looking at your crime prevention, international criminal justice, looking to prosecute and bring those to account who are responsible and have a deterrence effect against a perpetration. But then, of course, that attack, as Daphné mentioned in relation to health, it could in turn trigger secondary hazards. And that might be CBRN, it might be public health, it can be environmental effects, there can be duties on a state in relation to other states where there might be transboundary harm. And actually that's a completely different set of legal obligations. And sometimes the way the sectors and ministries are set up and wider institutions is they make it very difficult to bring these two paradigms together. Yet thinking about that multi-hazard scenario, it can raise lots of different questions in terms of capacity. Where do you prioritize your resources? If you do have a CBRN contamination effect to deal with, then what issues of cooperation with other states might arise? And an overarching goal of all of this is to reduce risk. And what does that mean in real terms? It's looking at how do you reduce the number of people who lose their lives, or who become sick, or they might lose their livelihoods, or there might be economic, physical, social, cultural, environmental, short, medium and long-term effects. So in addition to looking to broaden the conversation in terms of multi-sectoral approaches, and as I've mentioned, there's almost a risk aversion to go beyond that. And actually at the moment I'm on part of 3 organising teams under the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction that is responsible for the biennial, regional and global reviews of the Sendai framework. And actually I'm part of that conversation and experiencing some of these issues of how you get people to even be willing to take the risk of looking at new partnerships. It's the issue of multi-hazard. And in terms of what do I mean by multi-hazard? Well, from the example that I've given, it's where you don't just have one hazard to deal with, but there might be different hazards simultaneously. There can be a cascading effect. It might be cumulatively over a period of time. It might be immediate. It might be longer term. And that can be particularly problematic, particularly if you were thinking, for example, of where we've got these existing paradigms of security and disaster, that if you have a black swan type event, so it's high impact but low probability of occurring. And we saw that with 9/11, where you have massive catastrophic damage, that how do you join up these responses in a more effective way? And interestingly, even from the collaboration with Daphné and Bill, and from what we've heard from our medical expert, is that when you look at these joined-up approaches, is the UK, the US, and Israel are probably the exceptions in terms of many states, in terms of having broader multidimensional thinking. And it was, I found it particularly notable, early this year in June, the UK reissued its counter-terrorism strategy called Contest. And what was very noticeable, that in addition to the criminal justice and crime prevention elements that you would expect in the counter-terrorism strategy, that it was starting to factor in more the disaster management aspect. And even within the context of the strategy, it's starting to talk in the language of disaster risk mitigation. So that's sort of heading in the right direction. So in terms of the sort of multi-hazard, and we've heard, the practitioner on the ground of where that might impede, certainly in terms of broader goals, there is a sort of increased movement towards looking where there might be benefits of a more all-hazard approach. And it's interesting to note that the OECD recently issued a report on multi-hazard approaches, and it was looking where the non-nuclear sectors could learn from the nuclear sector, because certainly in terms of nuclear security, with many of these disaster management issues, because of the catastrophic effects that they could have, they have very well developed systems and practices. So there's part of a broader conversation going on now within other sectors as to what best practices can be learned and implemented within other sectors. Then in terms, another one, Kristian introduced the concept of governance, is that both in relation to man-made disasters, and I would view a terrorist attack as a man-made disaster that may or may not be technological in nature, or a natural disaster, and of course you might have a NATEC, which is a combination of natural and man-made. That a common recurring theme is governance, poor governance in terms of systems, processes, standards, regulations. And again, out of this whole sort of body of legal norms and principles that exist, yes, they're binding directly only on states, and states are parties to particular treaties, but they can also offer a reference point in terms of developing standards, codes, guidelines, and Bill alluded to some of the concerning issues, including from a governance perspective, in relation to critical national infrastructures. And again, this is a way where the law could add further strength and resilience and help to address some of those vulnerability issues. Not least, it has a lot to say on issues such as accountability and what that might look like, and also in issues of due diligence. So this is something which all states have due diligence in terms of obligations to protect all citizens and others which are residing in their territory. They also have obligations to prevent harm, think of environmental harm, transboundary harm. And actually those due diligence obligations, they can filter down to the private sector as well. It may be more directly if you have private sector carrying out quasi-governmental functions. But even in terms of corporate governance, due diligence is concerned of where there is a foreseeable risk, that there's accompanying obligations to take reasonable and appropriate measures in respect of those foreseeable risks. And in cases where that's not the case, there's a sort of whole body of principles to deal with reparation for victims. Which is an aside, when I think of counter-terrorism, in terms of one of its primary objectives, it is to prevent victims from occurring. And yet, interestingly, in both a sort of counter-terrorism space and a disaster space, often the voice of the victims is one of the least heard voices. And as part of this governance and due diligence, another role that law can provide as a tool is helping to bring increased coherence and consistency to standards as well. And we often hear references to the benefits of mainstreaming and how that might be achieved. And again, it can just offer some standards and frameworks that can help to bring these different sectors together in terms of their thinking and their approaching in relation to risk. So in terms of what other key gap might exist, one issue at the moment, when you look at the sort of the very different conceptual and institutional divides between security, so CT, and between the disaster paradigm, is if you look at what happens in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. So say we're talking about a catastrophic attack, it's got significant impact. Well, in terms of cooperation, on the counter-terrorism side, it's concerned with prevention and with criminal justice. So the cooperation it's concerned with is mutual legal assistance that could, and that's aimed at bringing perpetrators to account. So that's investigation, prosecution, it can involve extradition. But it's not concerned with how the aftermath of a terrorist attack is dealt with. And in fact, there's been some sort of just ideas as to whether even the existing approach to CT in relation to cooperation should be broadened, so that where, for example, a significant terrorist attack has happened, whether it's against critical national infrastructure, that's likely to be the most impactful, where it's beyond the capabilities of an individual state, whether the sort of parameters should be broadened to think about the cooperation and assistance that should be given to states in the aftermath of a terrorist event. And what you have at the moment within the disaster management paradigm is that there are tools on cooperation, but they tend to be quite ad hoc, so you can have bilateral agreements between states, but there's not an overarching legal framework that deals with this situation of cooperation in this security CT style scenario. So in terms of where might we go from here in terms of addressing it? Well, Daphné, Bill and I, we were just thinking about, because at least in a research environment, you can indulge in a little bit of blue skies thinking. But thinking, well, actually, at the moment, international disaster law, it's a hybrid law. It's got some of its own legal instruments, but it draws primarily upon many other existing treaties. But it's very dynamic, and it's in a context at the moment of evolution. And thinking, well, actually, now is the opportunity to inform its direction of travel. And looking at the broad concept, taken, for example, in the Sendai framework I mentioned to disaster, that including man-made and technological hazards, thinking, well, why couldn't the law in its current evolution be influenced? That you have a subset within disaster law that deals specifically with terrorism-related issues, that it brings together the existing principles that exist that meet the security, the criminal justice, but also the disaster preparedness and response, and bring it together. And indeed, you might even have sub-themes of that in relation to particular hazards. So if there's a CBRN element to it. And again, it looks at what already is there. So it's not recreating the wheel, but it also identifies where are some of the gaps, like the cooperation gap in the aftermath of catastrophic terrorist attack. And actually, what the law can do is, by analogy, it can draw on existing principles, what exists, and it can help to influence not only future legal tools, but policy and even discourse, or even in terms of people's thinking of looking beyond the obvious in terms of the existing concepts and institutions. And ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? It's increased preparedness. Increased preparedness means improved response. And that can either prevent certain hazards from occurring, potentially, or certainly have the potential to mitigate the impacts that they may have. So that was just a few reflections I wanted to share with you.
So some of us have been jotting notes while the rest of us have been speaking, so perhaps a few minutes of follow-up and then an opportunity for you to ask questions.
Yeah, isn't it? Say it again.
We're going to go around the table now for any who wish to comment on the discussion so far.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of piggyback a little bit on the conversation before we open for questions. A couple things about Israel. I thought this was so enlightening. In a way, it confirmed what I was saying initially, which is we're very good at preparing for certain types of threats and disasters, and we are maybe less good at others. That said, I know that we are working on the earthquake threat, so hopefully we'll get as good about that as we are with, unfortunately, I guess, on terrorist attacks. But so yes, we are very prepared to deal with a very specific type of threats, okay, which is a terrorist suicide bombing, potentially, or a terrorist attack in the middle of Tel Aviv or in some of our other cities as well. But I think it's really interesting that Israel has apparently rejected this multi-hazard approach by building strong expertise in this field, and potentially, tsunami may not be the top priority here. But at the same time, and I'm sure that a lot of you would agree with that, when we listen to you explaining to us the type of expertise that we've built dealing with this, so much of it would be highly relevant to any state trying to build resilience to, I think, definitely for terrorism, but I'm saying like even much broader than that. I thought everything you said about societal resilience, everything you said about designing hospitals to deal with emergency, triage rules might not be exactly the same triage rules, but having them, training your people, how you deal with the aftermath for the health professionals, educating and empowering the public. There's so many aspects of what you mentioned that even though, of course, they are key to their specific response and preparedness to this type of threat, I think they would be incredibly valuable. And I saw everybody being extremely attentive to what you were saying because it has such a profound, it resonates with other types of threat as well. Maybe not all of it, but definitely about 70% of it, or if not more. And so another thing that it brought home for me is a point that Kristian made in his presentation very early on in the presentation about disaster memory. And of course, it's unfortunate that Israel has had to develop this incredible expertise, and that obviously I don't think there are many states that are that good at it. But so it's because of the reality here. And then to me, what it underscores is actually the need for information sharing, for learning. So there's so much that other states can learn from Israel about this, and then I'm sure we could learn from Japan about some other types of threats and how to deal with those. So meaning that I don't know if this is going on. I don't know if you receive delegations. Maybe you do, and showing them the basement, the parking lot at Ichilov. By the way, I just on a personal note, I've had 4 children at the Tel Aviv Sourasky Medical Center. I absolutely have an amazing relationship with Ichilov, which I dearly love and admire as a hospital, and specifically about the parking lot. And I always wondered, how come it's so nice? It's shiny. It's incredible. And then suddenly you brought it up to me today that it's because it's going to be used, hopefully it won't be used, but it could be used to put how many beds?
750.
Okay, so that made a lot of sense to me. Anyway, so that's on a personal note. But anyway, so disaster memory, information, learning and sharing. And I think even though this expertise is built for a specific purpose, there's so much more to learn for other hazards as well. And I don't know, I would love to hear how you guys think about that. So if anybody else wants to.
Oh. Sorry, yeah, got our own mic. Thanks. Interesting. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I want to lash on to your 2 insights, the kind of long-term coping and the criticism of the multi-hazard approach. And for the long-term coping, just I think disaster memory is the right kind of. It's about the frequency, right? It's not surprising to me that you are better at coping with this than other places because it's become part of a reality. And obviously the reason why a disaster knocks us out is because it's not. It's surprising. It's something completely different. Some would even define disaster as overwhelming the existing capacities. So if you go through kind of disaster management systems, most would say a disaster is when we can't handle it, when we need outside help. That's when it's a disaster. You can have the biggest an incident you want, but if we can handle it, it's not a disaster. So frequency and disaster memory, I think, plays vital roles in that. And the question is then, how can we create that kind of living disaster culture to strengthen us also for things that wouldn't appear as often? Good. Multi-hazard approach. I think you're discussing 2 very different things. I think it's a strawman discussion because obviously there's this inherent dilemma in this is that on the one hand, we need more and more specialized professionals like yourself. But on the other hand, we need coherence in the system. So there's an increasing need for coherence across these professionals, as well as this kind of incredibly pointed specialization. And when people talk about, at least the people I talk about the multi-hazard approach, they do not talk about the fact that you should specialize or that we don't need people who knows every bloody thing about earthquakes or terrorist attacks. No. They're talking about the need to coordinate these people because often someone at some level needs to think across these hazards and not in kind of sectorial thinkings. For years and years, the last 60 years, it's well documented. If anyone's interested, Tom Birkeland has written a number of books about it. Every time there was a disaster in the US, there would be a new law. And it would be on that specific disaster. So after a hurricane, there would be a Hurricane Act. After a tornado, you would have a Tornado Act. And the multi-hazard approach is an attack on that. It's an attack on only learning about hurricanes from a hurricane response. It's a challenge to say, what can we learn about our general preparedness in society from your experiences? Not to say that you should stop specializing or stop applying your expertise, but to try and solve the challenge of generalizing this so we can be stronger across hazards. Yeah.
I think that what you both said, Daphne and you, goes to one of the major issues with disaster preparedness. I go to many medical disaster conferences, meetings. I'm part of many organizations. I teach, I learn, I write, I review. It's all about the medical aspects of disaster management. Very few times have I been involved in such a multidisciplinary conference where I'm the only physician, I think. in the room. And I've been involved sometimes, I've been invited to speak at an ethics conference. I've been involved in a disaster ethics project in Europe. But there were 90% ethicists there who've never ever seen a disaster except on TV. No disrespect. And they were developing the ethics framework for response to disaster, trying to decide how I, on the ground, will decide, as we talked about before, whose leg to amputate first, or not at all, and let die. Yeah. Okay? So I think there's a significant disconnect between the various concepts and the various disciplines that deal with disasters. When you talk about all hazards approach, what I mean about that, and I agree with that, is that this should come together. These different specialties, the different concepts, they should come together and talk about disaster. What I talk about specific disaster response is how disaster is responded to and prepared to. Last year, I had to prepare for a hazmat drill in my department. It took us 6 months to prepare for it. Tomorrow, we start preparing for a radiological drill. It will take us 3 months to prepare for it differently. Different concepts. Professionally, it's so different that to me as a professional responder, it indicates that we talk about different things. When you say all hazards, you mean the overarching principles of law, ethics, national type preparedness. When I talk about different types of disaster, I talk about the response, not the local individual response, but the actual response to disaster, the actual mitigation of a specific disaster. I prepare for rocket attacks by building bomb shelters, among other things, and maybe changing government. But beyond that, I cannot prepare for I cannot prepare for a tsunami by building shelters. And when Sandy came in, everybody was prepared for power outages in New York, except the generators were in the basement. And they had no power within like 3 hours, because they were preparing for a different type of disaster. Was that a whole hazard approach? No, they were preparing for a specific type of event. So to sum up, I think that my take-home message is that there needs to be interdisciplinary discourse, because we see things differently, and because we all have different takes on it, which is as should be, if we talk about our differences and try to come to an understanding.
Thank you for that. Yes, and so I guess sort of just picking up on Daphné and Pinchas' comments, where I think law can bring added value, looking at the sort of because if you're looking at an all hazards approach where that's appropriate and needed, you can't have an all hazards approach without a multi-sectoral approach involving all the different sectors, the public and the private sectors who are involved. And where I can see some added value, and this is not the conventional black letter law, this is thinking much more dynamically, is where there are gaps and disconnects between these sectors. There are a lot of legal tools which can help to fill those gaps, help to strengthen the governance, help the cohesion and consistency, and even the dialogue across those sectors. I mean, even as a sort of other brief example, something different I've been looking at is a gap within the existing international frameworks governing organised crime and terrorism in relation to intangible technology transfer. So this could be weapon blueprints. The current legal regimes, which were written in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the organised crime regime was in 2000, 2001. It's concerned with physical weapons, not the transfer of weapon blueprint and technology. So that's not criminalised, it's not a serious international crime, nor is the use of technology like the internet to share that technology. Personally, I see that as posing quite a significant threat to international peace and security, having those two gaps. And I've looked at that in the context of three-dimensional printers and technology which is being produced to, for example, three-dimensionally print resupply missiles in the battlefield. And if that falls into the wrong hands. But looking at sort of multi-sectoral, having looked at that from an international sort of criminal law perspective, I'm currently speaking with the insurance sector and saying, actually, that poses a risk for you because here is an area of risk that if these weapons, they fall into the wrong hands, it could involve a cyber element to it, certainly getting hold of those weapon blueprints, and actually a failure to properly regulate and criminalise within the cyberspace more generally, but also in relation to these serious international crimes. When you follow the narrative through its various stages, I think actually that increases the risk of a catastrophic attack being perpetrated that you'll have to pay out for. So you should be concerned in crime prevention because it's actually directly relevant to mitigating your risk within the insurance sector. And of course the technology sector is also part of that conversation because they've got, for example, the Wassenaar agreements, but they're voluntary agreements amongst the trade sector. So it's looking actually as a tool of being able to link up different sectors with another layer of the conversation and the understanding of risk and how we can reduce that risk.
You know, you've been a very attentive and patient part of our workshop here this afternoon, and we haven't even given you a break. We're not going to. But we are going to give you an opportunity now to ask questions of our panelists, and instead of a break, we'll likely get out of here a little ahead of what the printed schedule says. What questions do you have for any of us, sir?
I have a question. Directly for Dr. Lauda, but it's connected to kind of all of you.
Yes.
I'll go through what Dr. Barak said. Used to be one of my teachers, actually.
Hello.
No.
Started here. Anyways, your theory at the very beginning of the entire panel was preparation. Preparation, looking ahead based on what we learn. Now, when it comes to counterterrorism, if we're looking at specifically like dirty bombs, unconventional attacks, not only from a terror actor, a non-state actor, but even from an enemy country, that is kind of problematic. Because at the moment we actually have a terror attack or a dirt bomb. Let's say a dirt bomb goes off in Rome. I'm originally from Rome, okay, my old city. Let's say a dirt bomb goes off in Rome, and as Professor Banks said at the beginning, the intelligence doesn't have a lead on whether it's an enemy, like an enemy state, or a terror, like a non-state actor. The moment they actually figure it out, now we have, let's say it's a terror attack, we are gonna have not only a dirt bomb that went off, but also panic among society. People are gonna be freaked out, very simply, because it's the middle of Europe and no one is used to something like that. And if it is an enemy state, on the other hand, then we're gonna have people, especially now in Europe with the rise of the right, that are gonna call for revenge. And we're gonna have policies way more strict, way more even racist, and people that are gonna call for an all-out war. So how would you deal, how would you approach, how would you prepare for a disaster when it comes to unconventional warfare, not only from a non-state actor, but also from a state actor?
Kristian, that's an easy question for you.
Okay.
Totally easy. Thanks. So, just to be very, very clear from the offset of this, I'm going to try and answer it anyways. I never made any claims about preparing for war. My research is about natural disasters. I think nonetheless that what you're sketching out is a number of different social modalities that you need to practice and where you need to inform your population. It's not, you can't improvise communication to your local population on the spot, or you shouldn't. You should have prepared what you want to do, in which order, who does it, how do you want to do it. All of these things would fundamentally require that you as a system had thought about the civil protection aspect of a potential war situation. And I'm sure actually that the defense forces of Italy are doing that this very moment. They've had elaborate plans for how they would do that. If what you're asking is what can we learn from the disaster management side to this already ongoing civil protection planning, I think that you can look into some of the more refined thinking about vulnerabilities and how you can engage with the population before an incident like that happens. Obviously, war and terrorism has the downside that it's cluttered in secrecy, right? You can't publicly make available what kind of plan you want, because that could potentially be a liability that terrorists or an enemy state could use. So if you had evacuation routes publicly lying around, that could potentially be a new target for an enemy. While when it comes to natural hazards, you want to inform them people as much as possible beforehand. But even then, I think there are still things that you could do to engage with local population. And I think people are doing that. There's been studies of the risk perception among Europeans vis-a-vis the actual risk of a terrorist taking place. And the Europeans think that the risk is much higher than it actually is. So I think there's quite a lot of preparation already taking place mentally as well as physically among the European populations, including in Rome, if that was the example. I'm sorry, that was really a bullshit answer, but I really did my best to say something meaningful.
I wouldn't say that. Yes, ma'am. Kristian, you want to give the upbeat answer, and then I'll dash it.
Thanks for that question. Yes, you're right. I'm sorry, I am a lawyer, so I always come to think about these issues from kind of a top-down perspective and speak about it accordingly. I'm sorry about that, because you're absolutely right. A number of incredibly interesting things are taking place bottom-up, and especially enabled by social media. The Dresden floods in Germany was a terrific example of that, where huge volunteer communities organized to carry what is called sandbags to stop the flooding. In fact, the German defense were not able to fulfill their mandate in certain places because volunteers had literally done it before them, filling up sandbags and securing the riverbanks. So there's a lot of things going on these years with volunteers and how they organize and how these communities stay active after the events. So even today we have active communities in Dresden, for instance, online social media sites where they keep each other informed about new stuff within flood risk and how would we do it the next time? They even have a small kind of organization of themselves. There's been a lot of critique of this because obviously the problem of this is to have non-professionals doing professional work is that you risk they mess it up, right? You can't have so flood securing would be one thing. Could also be terrorism. It's a substantial risk that community like that you sustain or help sustaining could also spread information that is not counterproductive to actually making more people more resilient. And there's also been a huge critique of this whole resilience discourse that has taken place. So there's, in particular in the US, I would say, there's been a discourse within emergency management saying that we should now focus on community resilience. It literally means the state should not have as pronounced a role in these disaster operations. Rather, we should have the local communities taking responsibility for themselves. And this sounds good, but it is also the legitimacy for doing cutbacks. So after Hurricane Sandy, for instance, it was proclaimed that this was a huge victory for showcasing the American people's resilience to its natural hazards. And then FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was cut back with, I think, 15% on its budget. Boom! So there's a huge critique of this being kind of a neoliberal legitimization agenda for cutting back public spending on disasters, and that would of course not be good. So there's this duality to it. Obviously, we want people to be resilient and take part of it, but on the other hand, we don't want it to legitimize that the state does not take that role upon itself, because we do have and should have a duty to protect our citizens.
I certainly agree with the last point that Kristian made. And I agree with the premise of your question, Deb, that the best ideas are local. Disaster is local. Terrorism is local. Ultimately, it hurts where it hurts, and it hits. And you know, Israel, of course, is a unique society, not only because of the sort of long-term memory and living of disaster, terrorism throughout its history, and the remarkable preparedness that occurs here. I thought the presentation by Pinchas was simply fascinating. Every nation is different. Denmark is different than the US, is different than the UK, and so on. A lot of times the laws get in the way of allowing the locals to do their best. Sometimes it's a Hurricane Sandy type of situation. That was a few years ago in the United States. It was a terrible storm. There wasn't a lot of loss of life. There was a lot of destruction of property. But one of the sideshows that didn't even get picked up in the national media because of efforts of local politicians was that the New Jersey National Guard attempted to get into New York to help sandbag. Governor Cuomo wouldn't let Governor Christie's people through for political reasons. What? Many of you know about the terrible spectacle of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans, which was a devastating storm, killed a lot of people. It wasn't on the scale of the Haitian earthquake, but it was a terrible calamity in the United States. There it was Keystone Cops. The feds started to intervene, realized they didn't have the authority without a presidential declaration. The United States has a federal system, so the presumption is that all decisions have to be made locally about public health, safety, and welfare. The governor called the president and said, please come, but I'd like to control the troops, please. Send in the military, send in the National Guard. The president and the director of FEMA hemmed and hawed and watched TV and did nothing for 4 or 5 days as the worst was happening. And the governor and the president couldn't come to an agreement. So the feds arrived about 8 days late after virtually all the damage was done. The local officials were overwhelmed by the capacity of the disaster. And then still FEMA was cut back. FEMA can't intervene in the United States without a presidential directive or a military attack. If we have a combined disaster and terrorist strike, if it's a dirty bomb on top of something that's naturally occurring, in the United States, that presents an even more complicated picture, because there the military has a duty to defend the United States against attack. They wouldn't wait for a governor's request, but absent an attack of that nature, then the locals are in charge, for better or worse. They don't have the resources that the federal government has. They don't have, we're a different society than Israel. Our levels of preparedness, our memory, but for 9/11, none of us would have ever been anticipating terrorism in the United States, and except Boaz Kanor. He's a special case. Yeah. So I don't know if I've responded to your question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Based upon discussion you were having just before, how much of the government intervene in terms of getting involved in disasters like Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and just leaving everything to the local population? How much of the government intervene?
Well, the presumption in the United States is that the disaster is local. And for there to be federal intervention, the governor has to request it. The president can intervene unilaterally only if he makes a determination that the locals are unable to manage the disaster. And that's a difficult determination to make, and it's politically risky, of course, as well. One of the aspects of the Hurricane Katrina thing was a Republican president and a Democratic governor, and a male president and a female governor. We could go into other dynamics of that relationship, but it's probably not worthwhile.
Yeah.
Yes, sure.
I think there's two more things that may need to be said about that. There are two major types of disasters in as far as management of the disaster. One that does not affect infrastructure much, and one that does. And there's a huge difference there. If you have an epidemic, a pandemic, it does not affect infrastructure in any way, shape, or form. Well, it does, because it may take professionals away that are sick, but that way. And it develops fairly slowly. And then it becomes a medical management issue, pretty much, although there may be huge numbers of casualties. Conversely, you may have a relatively small number of casualties with significant infrastructure being affected. And that requires top-down involvement. So again, coming back to my previous premise of not all hazard approach, you may have hundreds of thousands of casualties from an influenza epidemic, and yet the infrastructure is in place, and it's a mixed government local.
Yes.
But if you have a tsunami, or an earthquake, or flood, then you absolutely need the government with the locals helping, because very often the government will fail. And let's forget politics. Let's assume politics are worked out, except for the US and in Israel. But in many other countries, this has been worked out
Yes.
more successfully.
That's true. Very good comment. Others? Yes, sir.
This is directed to Dr. Richemond-Barak and Dr. Lauta. It's particularly
regarding the fact that you both discussed disaster management and dealing with disasters in states. I wanted to ask about non-state actors like de facto states, secessionist movements. So, for example, Dr. Lauta talked about assisting and facilitating efforts in Bangladesh, for example, or in Haiti. How would that work, for example, in an entity like Somaliland, which does not receive any recognition from any state, to my knowledge? How would countries, say like Russia or the US or China, be able to facilitate in efforts while acknowledging the fact that they do not recognize it as an entity, but rather as part of Somalia? That's my question.
You already dealt with the other. Maybe I'll take this one.
Go.
I mean, I'll try. So here we go back to the politics, right? And I think, I spoke quite a bit with Magen David Adom on these issues, and like Professor Halpern, they've gone obviously abroad and they've helped in foreign rescue operations. It has to be at the request, of course, of the country that is calling them. So that's one issue. First of all, you need to be invited. And then if you don't have diplomatic ties, or because, it's not a country, or because, it's an ungoverned space, or if it's a failed state, I can't really, I think there would not necessarily be a political will to go. I mean, it sounds quite extreme, I think, to say that. but I'm not sure from what I've heard that a state would be willing to go in such also a dangerous place. Like, meaning like there's a risk also, and talking about insurance and about accountability and stuff, like you take a risk going to a place like Somaliland or a failed state of some other type. So I'm not sure they would go. I'm not sure they'd be invited. I'm not sure they would want to take the diplomatic challenge that goes with it or assume the risk that goes with it. And that again shows you that it's not all about people losing their lives, and there's a lot of politics. I think it's a major aspect of these operations about receiving the proper authorization. For example, if there was something in Israel and there's a foreign medical force that comes in, medical professionals, and they don't have, and you can correct me again if I'm wrong, they don't have an Israeli license or they are not authorized to work in Israel, then Israel may not be able to let them in to face a national emergency. Meaning,
It's actually not an issue.
It's not an issue here?
No.
Okay, but in some other states it is, right, exactly. Okay, so that's an issue that states would have to contend with, and again, if you're going to a place like that, it might be even more of a problem.
Maybe I can just add, it's obviously from a formal perspective, sovereignty is the first principle of international law, so you'll have to deal with that. But then there are actually a few examples, good and bad, of how this plays out. We had the Myanmar typhoon in 14, I think, right, with where Myanmar refused international help. And we had this discussion whether it would actually be cost to intervene in Myanmar military, whether we could actually force our way in, because the typhoon had affected certain areas of Myanmar or Burma, or sorry, for anyone engaged in the politics of that. There was the parts affected by the country were the parts occupying some of the minorities who were not represented in government. So there were suspicions that maybe the government found this an opportune occasion to get rid of some of the resistance. Nonetheless, it was decided not to go in, so sovereignty kind of upheld. But there are also very good examples of countries who are usually at very problematic geopolitical terms with each other, help each other. So during the China earthquake, the Sichuan earthquake, for instance, Japanese satellites provided imagery over the damage sites to the Chinese authorities. So literally the Chinese allowed Japanese satellites to take high-resolution pictures of parts of China, which I think would not happen on your every Tuesday. So there is definitely kind of these issues where disasters transcend. Yeah. More yeah.
Just one quick point. There is a huge third sector, which is the NGOs, which take, in fact, a huge chunk of disaster response, less of mitigation, but mostly of response, in fact, the biggest chunk. And they can go into this kind of situation very often because they have no political allegiance, they have no political limitations. Given security limitations, which often are an issue, they will be the one to respond mostly.
Nice point. Time for another question? Or have we exhausted you?
I just wonder, is your hospital prepared for a cyber attack?
Well, the quick answer is no. The longer answer is that we're trying very hard. It causes us a lot of grief. I cannot access my email from lots of places because there's so many firewalls now, and so many of my friends send me emails that bounce back, and so on. So we're trying very hard. Are we prepared? I don't think we're prepared yet, but it's coming. And then somebody will find the hole. Anyway, a 12-year-old hacker.
On that happy note,
Exactly.
please join me in thanking our panelists here today for the workshop. And thank you all for coming.